Welcome to page 82 of Anatomy Coloring Book. This is Dr. Stephen Harkins. And today we are going to talk about the circulation of cerebrospinal fluid. We briefly mentioned cerebrospinal fluid in previous lessons. And now we'll talk more specifically about how it circulates throughout the nervous system. Cerebrospinal fluid is very important as it is a fluid that surrounds the brain. It is not compressible. Fluid is not compressible. And it provides a support structure when the head is undergoing trauma or has been struck in a car accident, for example. It's important that the brain does not move backward and forward inside the head, and this fluid helps to prevent that. The CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, travels in the subarachnoid spaces, travels through the ventricles and subarachnoid space. Recall, subarachnoid space is below the arachnoid mater, and it has those cobweb-like projections in it. So every 24 hours, 150 milliliters of CSF circulates through the ventricles and the subarachnoid space. Cerebrospinal fluid is created in this structure called the choroid plexus. These structures we briefly talked about. There's one there, choroid plexus. Here in the lateral ventricle, choroid plexus. Here in the third ventricle, here's the choroid plexus. And in the fourth ventricle, down in the area of the brainstem, the fourth ventricle, choroid plexus. So CSF is being created in all of these choroid plexi. And it travels through the ventricles from the fourth ventricle to the third ventricle, and then CSF that's created in the third also travels down through the cerebral aqueduct and out through and into the fourth ventricle and out through this little gap right here. This little hole, it leaks through this little hole into the subarachnoid space. So the CSF will go from the ventricles right into this little spot right here. This little spot is called the aperture, the medial and lateral apertures. This little hole right here, it's a tunnel that travels from the ventricles to the subarachnoid space. Here it is right here. Oops. The lateral and medial apertures. An aperture of a camera is an opening, yes? It's an opening from the ventricles to the subarachnoid space. Let's get our terms. Let's review our terms here. The pia mater, of course, is this thin layer covering the brain, covering the cerebral cortex of each cerebral hemisphere. The arachnoid mater is, of course, this layer right here, and below it the subarachnoid space. This is the space where the cerebrospinal fluid will be traveling through the subarachnoid space. It's the arachnoid mater, yes. And of course the dura mater, the tough mother. The dura mater is this layer out here. This layer outside. Let's look at it from here, the dura mater. And recall that there was an outer periosteal layer of the dura mater and an inner layer of the dura mater, the meningeal layer of the dura mater. Cores coming together and forming the falx cerebri. And once again, the pia mater surrounding the cortex like a saran wrap around the brain. And the arachnoid mater. Oops. Arachnoid mater. And the subarachnoid space. Of course, this is a projection, a slice of the brain. Close-up slice. Now back to the flow of cerebrospinal fluid. As it leaves the lateral and median apertures in the fourth ventricle here, I wonder if we could go to a new color. Yes. The fourth ventricle, it's going to go through this little aperture and find its way into, from there to the subarachnoid mater. Let's say, it's hard to, from this diagram, we have to think in 3 dimensions here. So it's going to travel through, say, to this area of arachnoid mater. Cistern is just an opening. It's an opening of the arachnoid, subarachnoid space. So see the fluid traveling in the subarachnoid space underneath the arachnoid mater and underneath the dura mater and around here and into and surrounding the brain completely. Subarachnoid space. So all this fluid traveling here through in the subarachnoid space. And these arachnoid villus, remember these little projections right here of the of the arachnoid mater coming through the dura mater, projecting through. Well, this is an area where the cerebrospinal fluid will leak out through the arachnoid villus into this space right here, into, and now you got to think in 3 dimensions right here. This is right down the middle. This is the superior sagittal sinus. Recall the superior sagittal sinus. When the dura mater splits right here and forms the falx cerebri, this is the space between the 2 hemispheres. Brain hemispheres, okay? That's this space right here. The falx cerebri. Talking about this space, and it runs all the way along the brain. Right? So there's this sort of invaginated space in here running all along the middle of the brain. So here is that space right here, that invagination. Right? And popping out there into the superior sagittal sinus. So it runs all along here, right smack in the middle of the brain, separating the 2 hemispheres. Separating the 2 hemispheres right down the middle. So if this was your brain, and this would be, your nose right here, probably right here, your mouth, and your ears would be over here. This is your right eye and your left eye. But regardless of that, there's your brain split right down the middle, and that's what this is representing right here. So the cerebrospinal fluid travels through the subarachnoid space and leaks out through these arachnoid villi and at it from a different angle out through arachnoid villi, and it travels through and along the superior sagittal sinus. So there's fluid everywhere. There's fluid out on the out between your brain and skull here, and it also is in the middle of your brain. So there's fluid in between the two halves of your brain. So just to review and point out the terms, the dura mater, dura mater, the outer layer, the tough mother, the arachnoid mater, inner layer, right here, with the subarachnoid space beneath it. The pia mater wrapping very tightly around the brain like saran wrap. The first and second ventricles are these lateral ventricles, the right and left ventricles. Choroid plexus, these structures here that create the CSF and dump it into the ventricles. The third ventricle, right here, also with a choroid plexus. The fourth ventricle right here with its choroid plexus as well. The cerebral, here's your fourth. The cerebral aqueduct here is this aqueduct from the third to the fourth ventricle, carrying cerebrospinal fluid. The aperture, the opening right here that connects from the fourth ventricle to the arachnoid mater. And of course, the cerebral aqueduct leading to the central canal after the fourth ventricle here, the central canal all the way down spinal cord. Regarding the travel of the CSF into the arachnoid mater from the apertures, these openings, anywhere where there's an opening where it's not a narrow canal, it sort of opens up, called a cistern. Here's the superior cistern. Here's another opening in the arachnoid mater, called a cistern. Of course, the arachnoid villus here, the little projection out into the superior sagittal sinus, where the CSF travels, leaks out and travels into the superior sagittal sinus. Now, what happens to the cerebrospinal fluid? In the subarachnoid space, there are actually veins, cerebral veins, looking down to the right here, in the subarachnoid space. And what they do is they collect the cerebrospinal fluid and process it when it's, I suppose, used up. And so cerebrospinal fluid is continuously renewed. It's created by the choroid plexi in the ventricles. And in the subarachnoid space, there are actually veins in the subarachnoid space. And the veins will collect this cerebrospinal fluid and process it as waste, I suppose, and take it into the bloodstream to be excreted, and then more will be renewed in the choroid plexi. This concludes the lesson, page 82 of Anatomy Coloring Book. I am Dr. Stephen Harkins.